On the bright, crowded market morning, a rich man decided to build his own good name on the back of a poor woman's ruin. The wealthy leather and fashion house owner who controlled the guild the whole settlement was licensed through stood up in the middle of his grand boutique before the gathered market, pointed at a poor young woman who cut and stitched genuine leather bags and sandals by hand for a living, and told them all that she was a cheat. He said it plainly, so that every trader browsing his stacked polished handbags could hear him, that this stall woman had taken his money for hand-stitched leather goods and instead passed off cheap-glued plastic imitation, factory junk that was not leather at all, as her own honest handwork, that she had disgraced his house before a prestige client, that she owed back her deposit and heavy damages, and that he had finally caught her at it. Adaize Obiora did not weep, and she did not beg, and she did not run. Though his men were already pulling her bags off her stall, and the murmur of the market was turning against her, she stood in the bright sun, with a worn commission logbook held flat against her chest, and a small stitching awl in her other hand, the same book in which she had dated and sketched and measured and photographed and thumbprinted every bag and every pair of sandals of every order she ever took on, and let his accusation break over her, because there was nothing a poor leather woman could say into that powerful man's boutique that the frightened traders were ready to hear against him. And the fashion house owner performing his outrage did not know that the woman he was so sure he could ruin held, flat against her chest, the one thing able to turn his own accusation against him, and that within days a government standards officer would put a flame and a blade to those very bags before this same crowd, and it would show, plainly, which were the cheap plastic fakes, and which were true leather cut and stitched by a living hand, and whose hands had pushed the fakes in. The market did the thing a crowd does when a big man with power names a small woman a cheat first. It drew back from her. The traders with their own stalls of goods, the loaders, the people who had come only to buy and sell and go home, looked at a Daisy in her worn craftworker's apron, standing over her stock spread on the ground, and took their cue from the man who owned the biggest fashion house and half the guild. Because a powerful man's certainty is contagious, and it is always safer to draw back from the accused than to stand beside her. A few of the older market women did not draw back. They frowned and looked at the leather bags, because they knew what it was to make a thing with your own two hands all day, and be the first blamed when a big man decided he did not want to pay. But most of the market went with the chief, because that is how a fraud is made to look like justice. You get the crowd to agree the poor woman is the cheat, and then no one thinks to ask whose hands really made the fakes. And a Daisy felt the heat climb up her neck and the book press hard against her ribs, and inside her, quiet under all the noise, the one thing the accusation could not reach. She knew what she was. She had cut and stitched leather honestly for years, delivered every piece exactly as her own hands had made it, raised her young cousin on the thin margin without begging or cheating, and never once sold so much as a single glued plastic imitation as her own leather handwork. She lifted her chin the way her mother had taught her over a workbench when she was small, and said nothing aloud, because a woman who has made honest things with her hands in a market full of big men's names has already learned that the loudest boutique does not decide whose hands did the making. The fashion house owner thought he was managing a small nuisance the way he managed every nuisance, by deciding who was low enough to be ruined and doing it from a boutique where no one would argue. He had looked at the leather workers his house commissioned, seen a stall woman with no shop of her own and no powerful name behind her, and decided, long before that bright morning, that she was exactly the sort of unknown little worker he could rob quietly, and, if the swap were ever noticed, brand a cheat to carry it for him. He had spent his whole comfortable life seeing in people like a Daisy, not what they made with their hands, but how much of it he could take and pin the loss on them. Adaize Obiora was 28 years old, and in that settlement she was known by nearly everyone and truly seen by almost no one. The leather woman. The one who cut and stitched genuine leather bags and sandals at a small stall and sent finished pieces out for boutiques, weddings, and society gifts. She rose each morning before the settlement filled, in the single rented room where she lived with the younger cousin she was raising, and set to work, choosing and cutting each panel, skiving the edges thin, then saddle stitching each seam by hand with 2 needles and a waxed thread so patiently that a bag made by her hands was known up and down the lanes to be honest work, every stitch locked and true, and every piece meant to last a lifetime. She earned a thin margin for the slow handwork, taking so slight that one bad week, a customer who paid late, a slow season with no ceremonies, could leave her tin nearly empty. She was, everyone agreed, honest and skilled, and she had learned long ago that being poor and gifted with your hands at once only meant people used your careful work and forgot your name. The leather woman, they called her, half in fondness, and most of them did not know the half of what she carried, nor what one big man's fashion house had been quietly planning to cost her. She had not been handed her trade. No one hands a poor woman a living. She had built it herself, over years, the way the poor build anything that lasts, slowly, with sacrifice, and with far more discipline than the comfortable ever imagine. She had learned to work leather at her mother's side, who had cut and stitched bags and sandals for the trade before her, and when she found herself alone with a young cousin to raise, she had made that knowledge into her whole livelihood. One workbench, a set of round knives and awls, an old hot branding iron her mother had left her for burning her small maker's mark, and a name for clean, honest leatherwork that spread slowly from lane to lane. She saved what she could in an old tin, toward the one thing she wanted in the world, to lift her cousin out of the thin corner of that rented room and into a life with a proper roof and school fees paid without fear. And under it all, she kept the things she had never fully explained to anyone: an old branding iron, a box of hide-off cuts, and a worn commission logbook. Her days were long, and they were the same, and there was a kind of pride in the sameness. She chose, and cut, and skived, and stitched, and burnished, piece after piece, because a woman known for honest hands does not send a great house's order out with a seam gone crooked or an edge left rough. There were good weeks and lean weeks when she counted her coins twice and fed her cousin first and herself after, but she never once passed off so much as a single glued plastic bag as her own leather handwork, because a poor woman's honest name was not a thing she traded when times were hard. It was the one thing that stayed hers no matter how hard they got. That was the woman the chief looked at and saw nobody he could rob. Because there had been, from the very start of her trade, a slow and careful habit a Daisy kept that set her apart from every other poor leather worker in that settlement. She had understood, the way a person who makes things for powerful people comes to understand, that the day would come when a big man decided he did not want to pay for what he had ordered, and the poor hands that made it would be blamed for something to give him his excuse. Any other worker might have shrugged that fear off, or trusted that honest work alone would speak for her. But a Daisy did 3 quiet things instead. First, she kept her commission log faithfully. Every order she took on, before she cut a single panel, she dated the page, measured and sketched the bag or the sandals, wrote what was agreed and what deposit was paid, and had whoever commissioned the work press a thumbprint on the page beside the date. And then, as she worked, she photographed the piece at every stage on a cheap phone: the raw hide, the cut panels, the skived edges, the stitched seams, the finished burnished piece, and dated each picture, so that she held in her own hand a running record of exactly what had been ordered, from whose hand, and exactly how her own hands had made it, step by step. Second, from every hide she bought she cut and kept a small labeled swatch, and the off cuts in a box. against the day she might need to show what leather a given order had truly been made from. And third, she had learned, over years of cutting and stitching by hand, to know true leather and honest handwork from cheap glued imitation on sight. Because a woman who lived by her hands had better be able to tell real hide from plastic in the dark. What had first set her to it was a thing she saw, years before, when she was still new to the trade. Another worker she knew, a gentle older woman named Mama Ngozi, who had cut and stitched leather for the big houses for 30 years, was accused one season of taking a boutique's commission money and passing off cheap plastic bags as her own leather handwork, and was turned out of the guild for it. Her name broken, her small custom gone, and Adize, who had watched Mama Ngozi's honest hands for years, never believed for one moment that the old woman had done it. She watched a lifetime of careful work destroyed by an accusation the old woman had no way to answer, because Mama Ngozi had only her word and her tears, and a poor worker's word is nothing against a big house's claim. And something turned over in Adize's chest that never turned back. She understood, watching that gentle woman shamed, that the danger in her trade was not a slip knife or a slow season. It was the day a powerful buyer decided to keep his money and needed a poor hand to blame. She could not unbreak Mama Ngozi's name, but she went home and began her commission log that very week, and started photographing her work stage by stage, and keeping a swatch from every hide, and kept it faithfully from then on, because she was not built to walk into a trade full of powerful buyers, with nothing but her word to hold up when the day came. Here is the very thing this channel was built for, so let me say it to you plainly before we go on. If you have ever made something honest with your own two hands for a powerful person who takes as a matter of course, poured your careful work into it, handed over exactly what you promised, and kept quiet, careful proof, because you sensed that one day someone powerful would call you the cheat, then you already belong here with us, under the Baobab. Take one moment to subscribe to Baobab Tales, because the quiet, overlooked people who make honest things with their hands while the powerful plan to rob them, and who keep the one small proof that turns it all around, are exactly the ones these stories are told for. And I do not want you to miss what a rich man's lie was about to do to a Daisy Obiora in that crowded market, or what one flame and one blade and a photographed log were about to do right back. To understand the woman standing accused in that market, you have to understand the man who owned the fashion house. His name was Chief Nnamdi Eze, a wealthy luxury goods magnate in his 50s who had built a great fortune out of a leather and fashion house that outfitted the weddings and society galas of half the city, addressed as chief by everyone who needed to take a commission through his guild. He was not, to look at him, a wicked man. He sat at the head of the Artisans' Guild and gave to his church, and was forever spoken of as a pillar of the trade. The big man who could put a fitting leather gift into any celebration in Lagos. But under the rich agbada, and the heavy beads, and the easy public warmth, he was a man who had never once imagined he could be in the wrong, and who measured every person near him by what could be taken from them. The genuine hand-stitched leather goods his house was famous for supplying he had, quietly and through his agent, been faking for years, commissioning real handwork from a poor leather worker, buying cheap glued plastic imitation in bulk on the side, and, whenever he wanted to pocket the deposit and duck the balance, swapping the factory pieces in, and branding the worker who made the real ones a cheat who had passed off plastic junk. The cruelty in that market did not come from a criminal in the shadows. It came from a respectable big man who had turned the very craft of an honest trade into a fraud stall, which is a colder and more dangerous thing. And the thing that made Adize dangerous to such a man was the one thing he had never thought a poor worker would possess, a proof of exactly how her own hands had made each piece, and of what it had truly been made from. For the whole fraud rested on a simple certainty that the poor could never prove the work was truly theirs. The workers his agent framed had no dated log, no photographs, no swatch, no thumbprint on a page. They had only their word that they had stitched the real ones. And a worker's word is nothing against a big house's loss, and its claim that the delivered pieces were plastic fakes. Chief Namdi had built his robbery on that helplessness. He had never imagined that among the workers his house commissioned, there was a quiet stall woman who had been dating and photographing and thumbprinting every order for years, who kept a swatch from every hide, who could tell true leather from plastic on sight, and whose log held, in his own agent's thumbprint, the record of the very bags he meant to call fakes. He looked at a Daisy and saw a nobody. He did not see the receipt she had been keeping against his lie. The morning the sky broke came bright and busy, word already running through the market that the great fashion house had been cheated. A season's grandest society gala had been coming for a prominent family, and Chief Namdi's house had been engaged to supply the leather gifts and the fine bags for it, and, as his house so often did, had put the real handwork out to a poor worker on commission. That worker was a Daisy. She had taken the order on as she took on everything, dated and sketched each of the fine bags and sandals, cut and kept a swatch of the good hide, and had the chief's own agent, the man who brought the commission, press his thumbprint on the page beside the date. Then she had cut and stitched and burnished each piece by hand over many days, photographing every one at every stage, and delivered the whole order to the same agent, thumbprinted out, exactly as her own hands had made it. And she had thought no more of it than of any careful job well done. Until the market woke that morning to the news that the leather goods the great house had set out for the gala were cheap glued plastic imitation, peeling and coming apart, and that the poor stall woman who had been paid to make them had cheated the chief and passed off factory junk as her own leather handwork. It was the wrong thing to be blamed for in a rich man's market, because what had happened between her stall and the gala, a Daisy did not yet know, but would soon prove, was this: the chief's agent, taking the genuine hand-stitched leather goods from her hands, had carried them not to the gala but to his master, who put the real bags aside in his own store and set out cheap plastic imitation bought in bulk in their place. And then, when the moment came to pay her balance, the chief had his story ready before anyone could ask a question. He did not wait to be accused of setting out cheap plastic bags. He went out into his boutique that bright morning, before the whole market, and he branded her. He told the gathered market that this stall woman was a cheat. He said that she had taken his commission and his deposit, and, instead of cutting and stitching the bags by hand from real leather as she was paid to, had bought cheap glued plastic imitation and passed it off as her own leather handwork, disgracing his house before a prestige client at a society gala, and that the little book she was said to keep was nothing but a cheat's trick to look careful, while she robbed her betters. He said she owed back her deposit and heavy damages for the disgrace, and that he was within his rights, as the guild's own head, to seize her stall against it. And he gave the word, and his guild men pulled down her stock and spread her bags and the peeling plastic fakes out on the market ground, in front of everyone. Holding them up as the proof of her cheating, the poor cheat caught at last, her plastic fakes spread for all to see. And the awful machinery of it turned, not an engine of steel, but the older machinery, the one that turns an honest poor woman into a cheat the instant a rich man needs one. A Daisy stood in that bright market among her spread bags, and did not break. When they pulled down her stall, she did not throw herself down after it, and she did not scream, and she did not curse him. She stood very straight, with the commission log pressed flat against her chest, where his men had not thought to grab it, and her small stitching awl still in her hand, and she let them make their show. because she understood something the market did not. She understood that a man does not spread a poor woman's work on the ground calling it fake, unless he is terribly afraid of what an honest test might show. His loudness was not strength, but fear wearing strength's clothes, and she said, once, clearly, so that the older women at the edge of the stalls heard her, that she had dated and sketched and photographed those bags at every stage as she stitched them, that she had a swatch of the very hide, that his own agent's thumbprint was on her page for the order, and that she would ask any officer with the authority to simply test the leather and read her log, and that a man who feared a poor woman's photographed record had something to hide. Then, she gathered what stock she could from the dust, took up her awl and her book, and walked out of that market with her chin up. And behind her the chief told the crowd he would be bringing her before the guild and the authorities to have her fined and banned, which was the proudest, most fatal mistake a cheating man ever made. Because in his certainty that a poor woman could never prove the work was truly her own, Chief Namdi did the one thing that would destroy him. He called in the authorities himself, to make his ruin of her look like law rather than robbery, and to frighten every other worker into silence. He reported a daisy to the Artisans' Guild and to the Government Crafts and Standards Office as a cheat who had passed off cheap plastic imitation as genuine hand-stitched leather and defrauded his house, and demanded a formal hearing to have her fined, her stock forfeit, and her name banned from the trade, summoning the very officer whose whole work is to assess whether goods are genuine and honestly made or cheap fakes, and packing his own market with traders to watch the poor cheat condemned. He was so sure the plastic bags would damn her that he invited the one authority on earth able to put a flame and a blade to a bag and say exactly what it was made of and how. He thought he was calling witnesses to her shame. He was calling them to his. This is the moment the channel was built to make you feel. So sit with it for one breath before we go on. Because if you have ever been called a cheat by the very person who was robbing you, and been so sure of your own honest hands that you longed for someone with real authority to simply come and look, test the material, read the record, match the thumbprint in the open where no big man's shouting could bend it, then you already know exactly how a Daisy's heart rose and shook when she learned that the chief himself had summoned the standards officer to his market. If you've made it this far into a Daisy Obiora's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Word of the coming hearing traveled the settlement fast, and it reached the ears of a man who had been waiting a long, quiet while for exactly this. His name was Baba Tunde Adeyemi, a retired master leather worker in his 60s who had spent his whole working life cutting and stitching hide and judging genuine leather against cheap imitation, and who had come, in his retirement, to live near the settlement and watch, with a professional's slow anger, the way the poor artisans of that place were framed for frauds done above their heads. He had suspected the great fashion house's dealings for a long time. He knew that a house which keeps catching its most valuable commissions, faked by a string of unrelated poor workers, one after another, is not being cheated by the workers but by someone inside its own doors. But suspicion is not proof, and a retired man with no standing could accuse no one. What he had needed was a worker with a record, and a reason for the officer to come. Now, on the same morning, he had both. He sought a Daisy out where she was sorting what stock she had salvaged, told her plainly who he was and what he believed, and asked to see her commission log. And when she laid it open before him, dated entry by photographed entry, showed him the very page where the chief's own agent had pressed his thumb, and opened the box of labeled swatches beside it, the old man's hands went still, and his eyes filled, because he saw at once what she had built without quite knowing it, not a helpless certainty, but a case, dated, sketched, photographed stage by stage, thumbprinted, sampled, and his to help her prove. Babatunde did not take her case from her. He did the greater thing. He taught her how to make the officers see what she already held. He explained what her commission log was, a dated, photographed, thumb-printed record of exactly what her own hands had stitched, step by step, in the chief's own agent's thumbprint, so that it could be laid against what had actually been set out at the gala and show precisely where the real leather goods had been switched for plastic. And he explained the test that would turn it from her innocence into his crime, that leather does not lie about what it is. Touch a heated point to a hidden corner, and true leather only chars and smells of burnt hair, while cheap bonded imitation shrinks, beads, and melts with a chemical reek. Draw a blade across a hidden edge, and true hide shows fibrous grain full through, while the fake shows a pale paper pulp core under a thin plastic skin, and true hand saddle stitching holds when a thread is cut, where a machine seam runs and unravels. The seized fake bags, tested in the open before the whole market, would show themselves for the plastic they were, while her photographs and her matching hide swatch proved, stage by stage, that the real goods she had delivered were living leather cut and stitched by her own hands. The proof of her innocence was also the proof of his fraud, and hers was the only record in that settlement clean enough to lay it bare. And so, on the day the chief had chosen for her condemnation, the market filled. Traders and loaders and neighbors packed around the grand fashion house in the bright hard light. A long trestle set out for the hearing, with the seized fake bags and a Daisy spread stock laid out on it like exhibits, and Chief Namdi Eze moving among the crowd in a finagbada and his heavy beads, greeting the government standards officer with the warmth of a man certain of the verdict, the fabricated damages notice folded in his hand. He had summoned this. He had staged it. He wanted the whole settlement to watch the poor cheat broken by the law. He did not know that the plain retired man standing quietly beside the stall woman had once been a master leather worker, judged the finest in the trade, or that the photographed log under her arm and the awl in her hand and the box of swatches at her feet were about to turn his own hearing into the instrument of his ruin. The officer, a careful government examiner with no stake in the settlement's fear of the chief, did what such officers do. He ignored the shouting and went to the bags. And the first thing he asked for, before any accusation was read, was a good light, a clean blade, and a heated point. He took up one of the seized fake bags. A piece the whole market had been told was genuine leather the poor woman had been paid to make, and had instead swapped for junk. And he touched the heated point to a hidden corner of it, and it did not char like leather. It shrank and beaded and melted, and gave off the sharp chemical reek of burning plastic. Then he drew the clean blade across a hidden edge, and where true hide would have shown fibrous grain full through its thickness, this showed a pale paper pulp core sandwiched under a thin printed plastic skin. And the seam, when he tugged a snipped thread, ran and unraveled the way only a machine lock stitch does. Plainly, past any argument, cheap bonded imitation, not leather, and not hand-stitched at all. Then he laid that bag beside a piece of true hand-stitched leather and tested it the same way, and where the fake had melted and shown its pulp core, the real one only charred and smelled of burnt hair, showed fibrous grain full through the cut, and held its two-needle saddle stitch firm when a thread was snipped. A cheap plastic imitation against a living leather hand, past any argument. And a sound went through the packed market. Not a shout, but a low, cold intake of breath from 100 people who understood, all at once, that a plastic bag set out at the chief's gala did not prove the poor woman had cheated anyone. It only proved somebody had swapped her leather goods for plastic, and the question was suddenly, terribly, whose? And to be certain, the officer did not stop at one bag. He tested a second, and a third, and each seized fake betrayed itself the same way, while every piece a Daisy could show a photograph and a matching swatch for charred like true hide, and held its hand stitching. The whole seized order, the officer said flatly, was cheap bonded plastic imitation, and not one of them matched the genuine hand-stitched leather in her photographs and her hide swatch. And then he turned to the question the chief had not wanted asked: if the set-out bags were plastic, when had the real leather goods become fakes, before they reached the poor worker's hands, in her hands, or after they left them? And for that, the officer turned to the only dated, photographed record in the whole affair: a Daisy's commission log. Then the officer, with Babatunde at his shoulder reading the entries in the plain language of a man who had cut and stitched leather his whole life, laid the commission log open on the trestle and read it out to the market. He read the day the order came in, what was agreed, and the sketches a Daisy had drawn of the fine bags and sandals she was to make, and beside the date the thumbprint the chief's own agent had pressed when he brought the commission, and he held up the labeled swatch of the good hide she had cut from the very lot. Then he held up the phone and showed the dated photographs, one after another, of each piece as her own hands had made it, from raw hide to stitched seam to finished burnished piece, living handwork photographed stage by stage as she stitched. And he read the delivery entry, the day she handed the finished goods back, thumbprinted out by the same agent. The log showed, past any denying, that a Daisy had been commissioned to make genuine leather goods, and had made them by her own hands, and had delivered living handwork, every stage of it recorded, thumbprinted both ways by the chief's own man. And then came the blow that turned it from her innocence into his crime. The officer had the bags actually set out at the gala brought, and compared to her photographs and her swatch, and they did not match. Not in leather, not in stitch, not in make. The living hand-stitched leather pieces the agent had signed for on his way out of her stall had become, somewhere between her hands and the gala, the cheap plastic bags now lying melted and split under the blade. The goods had not been faked in her stall. They had been switched after they left her, on the chief's own side, by the chief's own agent, whose thumbprint proved he had carried her genuine handwork away. And then, to close the trap the chief himself had sprung, the officer and Babatunde pressed the question of where the real hand-stitched leather goods had gone. Genuine leather goods of that quality do not vanish into the air. They are far too valuable and far too distinctive. Quiet inquiry through the guild, which Babatunde set moving the moment he saw the case, had already turned up the trail. The great fashion house's own store, where fine hand-stitched leather bags matching the sketches and photographs in a Daisy's log had lately been seen set aside, and a bulk order of cheap plastic imitation that traced straight back to a supplier paid by the chief's own house. That bulk purchase, and the sight of her own photographed handwork in his store, pointed straight at the chief and his agent, the same man whose thumbprint sat in a Daisy's log on both sides of the order. The shape of the whole machine stood open now before the market, the great house commissioning real handwork, the agent switching it for plastic, the real goods kept back to sell as genuine, and the poor worker who made them branded the cheat, a thing his house had done. Babatunde said, not once but again and again, to one poor worker after another who had no photographed log to save them. And other workers began pushing to the front now, Mama Ngozi the gentlest of the trade among them. The old woman turned out years before, for a fake swept up beside the very same house, and the settlement understood, all at once, that it had watched not one cheat, but a long line of honest hands broken, to cover a rich man's fraud. And then came the public accounting, the part this channel does not skip, because a fraud undone in a whisper is no justice the world can see. The officer, before the whole packed market the chief had gathered to watch her shame, declared the set-out bags to be cheap bonded plastic imitation, machine-made, declared the genuine hand-stitched leather goods switched after they left a Daisy's hands, and set aside the damages notice as a fabrication. Every piece she had been commissioned to make, he said, she had made by her own hands from real leather, and delivered exactly, just as she had always said. And Babatunde, permitted to speak as a master leather worker who had served the trade his whole life, told the market in flat, merciless plainness what had truly happened, that Chief Nnamdi Eze had built part of his fortune out of robbery, commissioning genuine handwork only to have his own agent switch it for cheap plastic and keep the real goods to sell, branding one honest poor worker after another a cheat to pocket the deposit and duck the balance, and had done it to this one the moment her honest hands came near proving it. The market that had drawn back from Adaize in the bright sun now turned as one and looked at the chief, and it was a look no amount of money could buy back. Chief Nnamdi, who had come to see a poor woman fined before an admiring settlement and instead found the ground opening under his fine shoes, made the last mistake of a man who has never been contradicted. He tried to bluster over the officer as he had blustered over the stall woman, protesting that he knew nothing of what his agent did, that the woman and the old man had somehow faked the test, that the bags had been genuine leather when they left his house. But it was too late for that in a market that had just watched a plastic bag melt under a flame and split under a blade, and heard his own agent's thumbprint read off both sides of her log. A man who has spent years insisting the poor could never prove the work was their own cannot. When the record is read, and the plastic shows in the open, pretend to be its victim. And the officer, who answered to the standards register and not to the chief, cut across his protests with the flat authority of a man who has examined 1,000 goods. The bags, he said, are not leather. The record is clear. And this, he said, lifting the fabricated damages notice from the chief's own hand, is not a fine. It is evidence. And the consequences did not stop at the market. The agent who had carried the goods, switched them, and set the plastic out, was arrested and charged with fraud, with obtaining by false pretense, and with the seizure and destruction of Adaize's stock, and the trail of the bulk order and the hidden goods, once the police pulled it, ran back through him and into the chief's own house. The guild stripped Chief Nnamdi of the office he had used as a weapon, so that he could no longer stand as the trade's authority at all. And the greater ruin came the way it comes to such men, through the trail of dealings they were so sure no one would ever read. The boutiques and fine families across the city did not care to be seen beside a man exposed for switching the handwork entrusted to his house for plastic junk and framing the poorest workers in his own trade. Orders were canceled, partners stepped back, and his name became the thing traders warned each other about. He was ordered to make restitution, to restore Adaize's hand-stitched leather goods, and to repay, from his own pocket, every worker his agent had framed, and every deposit he had pocketed, and every stall he had wrecked. Adaize first among them, and Mama Ngozi, whose name he had broken years before, cleared and repaid at last. He had put the blame for his own fraud on the hands of the poor to grow rich, and the record, read honestly at last, named the real cheat and left him with nothing but a borrowed good name gone. For Adaize, the turn was not a windfall so much as a door. The world forced, at last, to admit what her hands had always been. Her name was cleared before the whole settlement that had watched her shamed, and cleared not by mercy, but by proof, which is the only clearing that truly holds. The restitution and the repaid commissions became the capital she had never been able to save, and she made of it exactly what everyone who had ever trusted her careful hands might have guessed she would. A proper leather workshop, no longer one woman at a small stall, but a real, growing concern. Proper benches and lamps and irons, and in time other settlement women she trained and paid to cut and skive and stitch and burnish to her honest standard. Every commission dated and photographed and thumbprinted and sampled in and out. The houses that had drawn back from her came to send work to her gladly. She took what she earned and did the one thing it had always been for. She lifted her young cousin out of that thin corner and into a real home, school fees paid without the old fear. The honest hands she had nearly been ruined for were hers again. and worth more now for having been spread on the ground before the whole settlement and found, tested and photographed and read to be exactly what she had always said they were. And Baba Tunde, who had waited so long for a worker with a record and a reason for the officer to come, found in the aftermath the work his retirement had been missing. He and Adeze did the thing that turned the whole story into something larger than the two of them, knowing how a single powerful house could quietly rob 100 poor workers who had no way to prove the work was truly their own. They set about arming the settlement's other small artisans with the very things that had saved her. To keep a dated, photographed, thumbprinted commission log for every order. To keep a swatch of the very material each order was made from. To learn true leather from cheap imitation and honest handwork from a machine. And to know their right to bring a disputed piece before the standards office. It was not a glossy foundation with ribbons and cameras. It was a plain, stubborn passing on of one poor woman's hard-won receipt to everyone still working under the same sky, so that the next time a big house switched real handwork for plastic junk and blamed the hands that made it, there would not be one leather woman with a photographed log to catch him, but a whole settlement of workers who knew how to prove exactly how their own hands had made a thing, and of what. And on an evening months later, when the new leather workshop was swept and quiet, and the benches stood clean under the cooling lamps, Adeze sat among her finished bags, with the old commission log open on her knees, and her mother's small branding iron resting in her palm, no longer a frightened woman's secret receipt against a fraud she could not name, but the proof, kept and honored. That honest hands and a true record held quietly through the lean years are stronger, in the end, than a rich man's name on another's ruin. Her cousin slept under a proper roof, in a real home her own two hands had at last been allowed to build. The grand fashion house she had once been shamed before stood quiet and diminished, and the crowd that had drawn back from her in the sun now came for the leather woman's own honest work. The truth had come out at last, and the woman they had branded a cheat was, in the end, the one whose hands the whole settlement knew had cut and stitched every piece exactly as she had always said. And so the fire burns low under the old Baobab tree. Tell me, before you go, when the powerful pass off their own fraud onto the poor hands that made the honest thing, and one honest woman's quiet record is what finally shows whose hands did the making. Do you believe such cheating is always caught in the end? Or only in the stories we tell under the tree? Stay a while, and tell me in the comments where you watched from.